Hi gang, and welcome back to my channel. This is Jason, and have you ever wondered about aperture and depth of field? Today, we're going to talk about that a little bit and see if we can't clear that up for you. In my last video, we talked about exposure. And in that, we talked about a thing called aperture. We talked about the exposure triangle, and aperture is part of the exposure triangle. On the three sides of the triangle, you have aperture, shutter, and ISO. Today we're going to talk about aperture specifically and how that affects your depth of field when you're taking photographs. I'm going to create separate videos for all three sides of the exposure triangle for aperture, shutter, ISO. And that way you can get a clear picture of everything that they control. So stay tuned for those, and please hit the subscribe button down below and hit the bell so you get notified when those videos come up so that you can watch them and learn all about the exposure triangle. When we talk about aperture, you've seen pictures described, and I've mentioned this in my last video, the f-stop or the F in front of a number that you see in a lot of pictures. Basically, like you'll see f2.8 or f8 or f11, f22, whatever. And what that is that's the aperture size. And what the aperture is the opening in your lens. So basically, when you open and close the lens, you increase or lower the aperture number on your lens. You're opening and closing the lens and allowing more light into your lens. So it's a little backwards. When you go to a number like f2.8, you're actually opening the aperture larger. So a smaller number, the aperture is open larger. When you go to a higher number, which say, for example, f22, you're actually shrinking that aperture down and you're letting in very less light. And that's what you're doing when you're changing your aperture. You're allowing in more and less light. But what that also affects is your depth of field. Basically, what depth of field is the distance between the nearest object and the farthest object that are acceptably in focus in front of and behind what you're focusing on. So for example, say I take this pen. If you focus on this pen with your camera, with your focus point in your camera, there's a distance in front of and behind that focal point right there called your depth of field. This is the focal plane. And those two distances can change. They can get narrower and they can get deeper based on the f-stop that you use. If you're at f2.8, that f-stop is going to be very narrow. If you're at f22, that pretty much everything in your picture is going to be in focus. When you're at a smaller f-stop, things get shallower. So basically what I mean by that is everything in your background is going to start to blur as you narrow that plane of focus. And everything in the foreground is also going to narrow, so it's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. This is your depth of field. The two main things that affect the depth of field are your distance to the subject and your f-stop, like I've said already. So basically, if you're able to get close to a subject, the depth of field is going to be very shallow. You're going to be able to control that much easier. For example, if you're doing a landscape and you're trying to encompass a wide area, you may want to go with a higher f-stop because your shallow depth of field may only get a few feet in front of you. So that's something to think about. Wherever you focus in that picture, you have to factor in the depth of field. One way I like to think of things is if I'm focusing on an object and I'm worrying about the depth of field, generally 1/3 of the depth of field is in front of the picture and 2/3 is behind what you're focusing on. So say you're focusing on a person, 1/3 in front of them, 2/3 behind is generally how I like to keep that in my mind so that you know that you're getting everything in focus. If you have a number of people and they're staggered, 1/3 in front, 2/3 in back, that's generally how I keep it so that I can get everything in focus that I want. And I use the appropriate f-stop. Another way to look at that is if you I usually keep in my head as well, more things, more Fs. So that's the easiest way to describe it. More things in focus, more Fs. So higher your f-stop, the more things are going to be in focus. The deeper your depth of field is going to be. So more things, more Fs. I set up an example for you. I set up 4 books, and I decided to take pictures of these 4 books to show you an example of depth of field. I set them at different distances away from my camera. The distance of my camera did not change, and all I changed was the aperture when I took the picture of these books. So basically I took one at 2.8, and you'll see the first book is the only thing that is really in focus. Then I moved to f8, and you start to see that the second book starts to get in focus. Then I went to f11, then I went to f16, and as I went through them all, I only went up to f16 because that's as high as the lens that I was using could go. As far as I went through those 4 stages, you can see the books start to come into focus. And that's what I mean by depth of field. More Fs, more things in focus. Just remember, like I said in my last video, all of these things are part of the exposure triangle: shutter, aperture, ISO. Today we talked about aperture, and all of these factor into letting more or less light into your camera, hitting your sensor so that you can take a properly exposed photo and get the photo that you want. So one thing I want you to check out that other video, check out the exposure video. I will have it linked down below. Please, while you're down there, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you know when I make more videos about the exposure triangle. And remember, more Fs equals more things in focus. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.